All eyes turned when she walked into the auction barn. A 12-year-old girl, too small for the doorway, too quiet for a place where everything had a price. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. In her hand, she carried a faded photograph. In her pocket, a folded letter. And in her heart, the weight of a promise made on a stormy night. No one knew her name. No one understood why she had come alone. But the dog in the cage near the back, the one with the gray muzzle and soldier's posture, he remembered. He hadn't seen her in over a year. But memory doesn't fade for those who loved in silence. She didn't have money. She didn't have a plan. All she had was a story no one had heard, and the eyes of a dog that refused to forget. This isn't just a story about loyalty, or grief, or courage. It's a story about how sometimes a child walks into a room full of adults and changes everything. Because some hearts don't need to be loud to be heard. Some bonds don't break, even after death. And sometimes the quietest battles are the ones that save us. Stay with us, because what happens next will show you that love, when remembered, can bring even the strongest dog home. On the northern edge of Hollow Creek, where pine trees line the gravel roads and the air begins to smell like wood smoke and dry grass, there stood an old red barn, once used for hay storage, now converted into a place where retired working dogs were auctioned off. That afternoon, the wind swept in low from Flathead Lake, carried with it the pale breath of an early Montana winter. Maple leaves, amber and brittle, fluttered across the tin roof, circling the yard like paper boats caught in an eddy. The wide barn doors creaked open as folks trickled inside. Ranchers in flannel, retired cops with thick jackets, dog trainers with clipboards, and a few suited buyers who kept their voices low and their eyes sharp. In the back of that stream of bodies, a young girl stepped quietly across the threshold, as softly as a single leaf falling unnoticed into the current. Her name was Emery Quinn, 12 years old. She lived with her grandmother in a weather-worn house on the South Ridge after her father, Officer Liam Quinn, was killed in the line of duty almost a year ago. He had served in the Hollow Creek Police Department for over a decade. Tall, quiet, and deeply kind, Officer Quinn was known by everyone in town. When he walked Main Street, kids would follow just to pet the dog trotting by his side, a large, sable German shepherd named Bramble. Since the funeral, Emery hadn't said much. She didn't cry often, at least not where anyone could see. But a few weeks ago, she received a letter from one of her father's old K-9 unit partners, a man who'd learned that Bramble hadn't been adopted into a family, like the records claimed. The dog had been surrendered for auction. Emery didn't argue with her grandmother that morning. She just put on her brown coat, packed her dad's old photograph and the letter in her pocket, and boarded the bus that rattled its way down from the foothills into town. Inside the barn, the air smelled of sawdust, old hay, and something metallic, maybe the cold breath of forgotten machinery. Rows of kennels lined the open space, each holding a dog that once had a job, a handler, a purpose. Now they waited behind steel gates, eyes flicking toward passers-by, unsure what to hope for. The auctioneer's voice boomed from a raised wooden platform. Numbers were shouted, paddles lifted, prices climbed. Occasionally, a dog barked in protest or paced in its kennel. Ceiling fans turned slow circles overhead, stirring up dust motes that drifted like tiny planets across the light. No one noticed Emery at first. She was too small, too quiet, too out of place. Her muddy boots didn't belong next to polished loafers and dress shoes. In one hand, she clutched a photograph faded with time. Her father, in full uniform, kneeling beside Bramble. They were smiling in the late sunlight of a long-gone afternoon. In the other pocket, a folded letter with ink smudged at the corners. She walked the rows carefully, not speaking, not reaching out to any dog yet. Her eyes searched, not for something new, but for something lost. She moved like someone following a memory through the fog. And then she stopped. In the last kennel of the far row, tucked slightly away from the others, was a large, older German shepherd. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't barking. He simply lay there, head low but eyes open, alert, aware, watching. His fur was peppered gray around the muzzle. One ear was slightly torn. But his eyes, when Emery stepped closer, He raised his head. Their eyes met, not in surprise, but in recognition. She knelt. The photograph trembled slightly in her fingers as she held out in front of the kennel. The dog tilted his head, staring at it for a long, silent moment. Then he slowly rose and pressed his nose to the gate. Emery reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The dog leaned in, touching his snout to the spot where her fingers rested. A low, almost inaudible whine escaped him. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear. It was something gentler, like a breath held too long. Finally exhaled. A man in a dusty blue staff jacket walked up behind her. He glanced at the dog, then at the girl, clearly puzzled. "That one's Bramble," he said softly. "Retired K-9. Tough to handle. They say he once knocked over a fellow officer just 'cause he thought the guy got too close to his handler." He paused. "The officer's name was Liam Quinn, I think." Emery looked up slowly. Her voice was steady but quiet. "That was my dad." The man took a step back, eyes softening, but said nothing more. He seemed to know that some silences are better left untouched. Outside the barn, the wind had picked up, making the rafters creak. Inside, the girl and the dog stare at one another across the divide. No one else in that building, not the buyers, not the handlers, not the man with the auctioneer's gavel, knew that something irreversible had already begun. Bramble didn't move away. His breath fogged the bars. His eyes never left hers. Emery reached up and pressed her small palm flat against the metal, right where his nose had touched. They stayed like that, unmoving, unspeaking, as though the world had paused to let them remember together. And then, so quietly it could have been a prayer, she whispered, "I came to take you home." The air inside the barn seemed to shift. Something in the way Bramble's ears perked, in the way Emery's shoulders softened, changed the mood like the hush before a storm. It was quiet, but not empty. Still but full. Outside, the Montana wind brushed past the barn's metal siding, rattling the loose nails in the beams like a whisper. Light filtered through the upper windows, and dust floated in golden slants across the air, dust that had likely clung to hay bales, dog fur, and the shoulders of men long retired. The world, for a suspended moment, was smaller than usual. Just a girl, a dog, and the echo of something too sacred for words. Emery didn't move right away. She stayed and knelt by the kennel, her fingers pressed to the cold steel, and Bramble pressed closer in return. The thick fur of his chest rose and fell with slow breaths, and when he blinked, it was a kind of blink that carried time. Long winters, long walks, long waits. And maybe love, too. The quiet kind that doesn't ask for attention. She didn't need anyone to tell her it was him. The gray along his muzzle, the thick scar above his right eye, the way his front paws always seemed to angle outward just slightly when he sat. All of it was there in the photograph she had carried like a talisman for months. But it was the way he looked at her that told her. That stare, deep, alert, almost human in its steadiness, was the same one that once looked out from behind her father in their family photo albums. There had been a time when Bramble was in every frame. A warm laugh from the front of the barn broke the spell. Somewhere near the auction stand, a bid had been accepted, and a man shook hands with the handler. A large golden retriever was being led away, tail swishing in wide, lazy arcs. But back where Emery knelt, the air was still thick and unmoved. It was as though the rest of the building existed on a different frequency. A man with a clipboard walked by, eyeing her briefly before continuing down the row. He said nothing, but gave her a slight nod. Maybe out of courtesy, maybe out of respect, maybe because something about her didn't fit into any of the usual categories he was used to sorting. And it was true. Emery wasn't like the others here. Most people who came to these auctions did so with intent. To train, to sell, to collect, to negotiate. They carried bank slips and contracts. They spoke in numbers and temperament charts. But Emery walked in with only a photograph, a letter, and a name whispered like a secret across the metal bars. Bramble. She looked around, scanning the faces, grown men and women, some chewing gum, others checking their phones, or sipping coffee from travel mugs. No one else seemed to notice what was happening in her corner of the room. She turned back to Bramble and leaned closer until their faces were just inches apart, separated only by iron and memory. I thought they gave you to family, she said softly, not expecting him to understand. I thought you were okay. Bramble responded with nothing but silence, not the indifferent kind, but the kind that listens. I kept asking after you, she added. They said you were gone. Not gone like my dad, just placed. Safe. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the folded letter, edges crinkled from her reading it over and over. It was dated 2 weeks prior, from a man named Carl Myers, a retired canine handler who had once worked alongside her father. The letter was brief. It simply said he had seen Bramble's name listed for auction and thought she should know. No explanation, no apology, just the truth, typed in a single line. He's scheduled for Hollow Creek's K9 release auction. Lot 42. The number echoed in her mind. She stared back into the dog's eyes, and he stared into hers, and somewhere between them, something began to close. Not like a door, but like a wound. You remember me, don't you? She whispered. His ears twitched. His tail gave the smallest shift. That was enough. It wasn't just recognition. It was reunion. A flash of memory struck her, sudden and soft, like a photograph projected across the inside of her eyelids. She was 6 years old, running barefoot to the field behind her old house, her laughter echoing across the tall grass. Her father stood near the tree line, watching with a cup of coffee in hand, and Bramble, younger, stronger than, chased her in wide circles. When she fell, Bramble stopped, sat beside her, and pressed his wet nose to her cheek until she laughed again. It had been so long since she'd laughed like that. Since he died, it had been quieter. Not just the house, but inside her too, as though all the loud, warm parts of her had packed their bags and gone with him. Until now, the smell of Bramble's fur, faint and familiar even through the steel, a mix of pine needles, worn leather, and winter air, brought her back to herself. Her throat tightened. I'm sorry I didn't come sooner, she whispered. I didn't know. Bramble sat down on the other side of the kennel bars, his body lowering slow and steady. Then he pressed his shoulder against the gate and let out a low, drawn breath, a signal, a trust, a choice. From the auctioneer's stand, someone called for attention. Lot 40 now closed. We'll take a short break before continuing with Lot 41. Emery looked up, startled by the reminder that the world hadn't stopped outside this moment. The reality settled over her like the wind shifting again, cold and indifferent. Bramble would be up soon. The bidding would begin. Paddles would rise. Numbers would climb. She had no idea how much she could offer, or if it would be enough. But what she did know, with more clarity than anything she'd ever felt before, was this. She wasn't leaving without him. Not because he was a dog, because he was family. The barn had grown louder now, the break time bringing chatter and footsteps and the rustling of paper. But Emery didn't move. She slid down until she sat cross-legged on the floor, facing Bramble through bars, the photo of her father still cradled in one hand. And as they waited together, girl and dog, both weathered in ways no one could see, a few people began to take notice. A couple in their 50s, sitting on the back bench, leaned forward. A young handler walking past slowed, then stopped altogether. Even one of the auction volunteers glanced toward them, curious. There was something about the stillness between them that didn't look like waiting. It looked like remembering. And, perhaps more importantly, it looked like hope, the kind that sits quietly, just beyond reach, until someone brave enough reaches for it. The wind picked up outside, steady and strong, brushing the pine limbs against the side of the barn with the sound of distant knocking. Inside, Emery stayed seated by Bramble's kennel, knees pulled up to her chest, her father's photograph balanced gently in her lap. Though the barn echoed with low conversations and clinking leashes, Emery was elsewhere, somewhere back in the hills, somewhere warmer, somewhere with the scent of cedarwood and the sound of a deeper voice telling a story she never wanted to forget. There had been a storm the night he said it. She remembered it not because the thunder had been loud or the wind fierce, though both were true, but because of the way everything inside their small home had felt softer that night. She was 9, maybe 10, curled up on the old plaid couch in the living room. The fireplace snapped and cracked, throwing bursts of orange onto the pine wood floor. Bramble lay stretched out nearby, his head on his front paws, eyes half closed but still watching, always watching. Outside, the storm swirled, wind tapping at the windows and rattling the gutters, the kind of storm that made trees bend and power lines sway. Her father sat in the armchair across from her, legs crossed, boots still muddy from the day. His police jacket was draped over the back of a nearby dining chair, and the walkie-talkie on the side table buzzed faintly with static. Never turned off, never ignored, just like him. He had just come home from a long shift. Bramble hadn't left his side since stepping in the door. Emery had asked him, "Is Bramble scared of storms?" Her father smiled, that tired, kind smile that came more often at the end of the day. "No," he'd said. "He's not scared of much. Just doesn't like loud surprises." Can't say I blame him. There had been a pause then. The logs in the fireplace popped. Emery had run her fingers across the corded edge of a throw blanket, tracing the lines without looking. She didn't know why she'd asked the next question. Maybe because she felt the way Bramble's eyes had drifted toward her and stayed. "Dad," she said, "what happens to Bramble if you don't come home?" The room had gone very quiet. He hadn't answered right away. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands loosely clasped, staring into the fire. Then slowly, he reached over and tapped the edge of the photograph that always sat on the mantel, the one of him and Bramble in uniform, standing in the golden grass beside a patrol car, the late sun giving everything a warm glow. "That dog," he said softly, "has saved my life more than once. He doesn't run, doesn't flinch. He waits, and he protects. Always." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his thumb against the edge of his jaw. His voice dropped a little lower. "If I'm ever not here, you take care of him the way he's always taken care of me." That was the promise. It wasn't said like a command. He hadn't looked her in the eye when he said it, but it settled deep into her chest like a stone in the riverbed, unmoved, even as water rushed above. Emery had nodded that night without fully understanding. Now, sitting on the cold floor of the auction barn with Bramble just inches away behind a cage door, she understood more than she ever wanted to. A gust of wind shook the barn's tin roof, and Emery blinked the memory away. The photograph in her lap fluttered slightly as the cold found a way in. She ran her finger along the edges, her father's arm around Bramble's shoulder, their shared look of quiet pride. The background was a blur of pine trees, the kind that surrounded their old house near the Flathead Ridge. Those trees still stood, even now, still waiting. After the funeral, the house had gone silent. Her grandmother didn't play music like her dad used to. She kept the curtains drawn tighter. Meals were simpler and often quiet. The police radio stayed off. Even the porch swing, once used every evening, sat unmoving, its chain gently rusting with time. Emery hadn't been allowed at the ceremony where they retired Bramble. She'd asked, twice, but the department said it wasn't protocol, said it would be confusing, said Bramble was being taken care of. That was before she learned what taken care of really meant. She hadn't said anything the day the letter arrived. She'd just read it at the breakfast table. Oatmeal cooling in front of her, sunlight streaking across the faded linoleum. The letter was plain. It didn't mention her father by name. It didn't explain how or why Bramble had ended up on the auction block. It only mentioned the lot number, 42. Now, sitting beside lot 42, she could feel the weight of time stretch between them, like a bridge built on memory and held together by trust. "Do you remember the porch swing?" she whispered to Bramble. He tilted his head, just slightly. "I used to read to you," she continued. "You fall asleep and kick your back leg whenever I hit the funny parts." A soft sound escaped him, not quite a bark, not quite a whimper, just enough to say, "I remember something." She pressed her hand to the gate again, and he pressed back with his nose. There were no words between them, just breath, warmth, an invisible thread of everything they had once shared to the man they both loved. Across the barn, the auctioneer returned to the stage, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll resume in 5 minutes with lot 41. Thank you for your patience." Emery looked down at her hands. They were shaking slightly. In her coat pocket was a folded paper envelope, old, soft at the edges. holding every dollar she had. It wasn't much, a few hundred from chores, a savings bond cashed early, her father's last birthday check never spent. Tucked between those bills was a yellowed sticky note with her father's handwriting. Keep it close, for something that matters. She glanced at Bramble again. He had settled onto the floor of his kennel, front paws crossed, eyes still locked on her like he was standing post. He hadn't looked away once since she'd arrived. The barn buzzed with movement again. Buyers returning to their seats, volunteers shuffling dogs behind the scenes. Emery didn't move. Her eyes burned, but she didn't let them spill. Not yet. From the shadows near the back of the room, a tall man in a charcoal coat stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his gloves. His gaze swept the room once, briefly landing on her before shifting elsewhere. He looked like someone used to getting what he wanted, someone who didn't much like being told no. Emery didn't look away, not because she wasn't scared. She was, but because fear had nothing to do with this. This wasn't about bravery or pride. It was about a promise whispered during a storm, about a dog who remembered, and a girl who did too. 5 minutes. That was all the time left before Lot 42 was called. Outside, the sun drifted lower, casting long shadows through cracks in the barn siding. Dust still hung in the light, turning gold like flecks of memory. Somewhere a train passed in the distance, its low whistle winding through the valley like a note from a song half forgotten. Inside, Emery closed her eyes, breathed in, and whispered one last thing to herself. You're not going back to anyone else. The wind outside had quieted, as if nature itself had paused to listen. Inside the old barn, people returned to their seats, boots thudding softly on the wooden floor, coats rustling as they settled back in. The auctioneer, a man with thinning silver hair and a deep voice like gravel rolled across weathered stone, stepped once more onto the platform. He tapped the microphone twice. Not loudly, but just enough to hush the murmurs of the crowd. We will now continue, he said, his words drawn out like lines on a weathered map. Lot 41, followed by Lot 42. Emery's breath caught in her throat at the sound of the number. 42, the one she'd traced a dozen times on the letter from Carl Myers. The number she whispered the night before, lying awake and staring at the slanted ceiling of her grandmother's guest room. The number she had circled, underlined, folded up and pressed to her chest like a charm. And now it was real, coming closer. She sat up straighter, pressing her palms into the floor to steady herself. Bramble stood, as if sensing the shift. He paced once, slow and controlled, then returned to gait and sat tall, alert, proud, ready. There was still strength in him, beneath the graying fur and weathered joints. It showed in the line of his spine, in the tension of his shoulders. A soldier at attention, waiting for the next call. The auctioneer cleared his throat again. Lot 41, 2-year-old male, moderate obedience, advanced agility. Starting bid, $2,000. The room stirred. A man in a black cowboy hat raised his paddle without hesitation. 2,000. Do I hear 25? Another bid followed, then another, but Emery barely listened. The world around her blurred into shapes and voices. Her heart had begun to drum against her ribs like someone knocking from inside her chest. She glanced at Bramble again. His eyes never left hers. In that look was a memory of 1,000 quiet moments. Bramble waiting by the front porch. Bramble trotting beside her dad down the gravel road. Bramble curling at the foot of the couch, head twitching in his sleep, as though still chasing something from his old life. And now this, a cage, a number, and strangers with paddles. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers brushing the envelope once more. She counted the money inside that morning. $725. Not much. Certainly not enough to challenge the polished buyers seated up front. Still, she whispered to herself, I have to try. Lot 41 closed at $3,500. The dog was led away, tail high, by a young man in jeans and boots who gave a satisfied nod to the handler. The room relaxed for a breath. Then the auctioneer raised his hand again. Lot 42, he announced. Retired working K-9. Name, Bramble. 8 years old. fully trained in patrol and obedience, strong instincts. Last partner with Officer Liam Quinn, deceased. The final word hung heavier than any number. There was a flicker of movement in the crowd. A few heads turned, a few murmurs passed. The handler opened Bramble's kennel, gently clipped the lead to his collar. Bramble didn't resist. He walked with quiet grace, his steps careful but proud, as though he knew what was at stake. When he reached the center ring, he paused, then turned his head. His eyes scanned the room, searched faces, and stopped when they found Emery. That moment, brief and soft, carved itself into everyone watching. Even the auctioneer faltered. "Starting bid," he said, slower now, "at 5,000. A man in the third row raised his paddle. 5,000. The auctioneer echoed, his voice finding its rhythm again. "Do I hear 5,500? Someone called from the left side, 55. 6. The auctioneer asked, scanning the room. A woman in a blazer lifted her card. 6. The numbers rose quickly. Too quickly. Emery gripped the envelope in her pocket. The room spun slightly around her. She could hear her own breathing now, faster, shallower, her pulse louder than the auctioneer. She stood. Her voice, unsure at first, found the strength it needed. 6,500, she said. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. Heads turned. The auctioneer paused, blinking toward her. Then he gave a courteous nod. 6,500 from the young lady in the back. There was a rustle of surprise. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "Is she serious?" Emery stepped forward, her chin up, both hands clenched into fists at her sides. A man near the front, tall, sharply dressed, with a face too smooth to be kind, lifted his paddle with a lazy confidence. 7,000, he said, his voice like polished glass. The air shifted. Tension tightened the room like the skin of a drum. Emery's heart sank. 7,000. It was more than she had, more than she could imagine having. Still, Bramble didn't look away. He hadn't once. The auctioneer scanned the room. 7,000 on the floor. Do I hear 7,500? Emery stepped forward again. Her cheeks flushed, her hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. 7,500, she called. The room gasped, not in mockery, but in something closer to disbelief. The auctioneer blinked. 7,500 from the back. Do I hear 8? The tall man turned, slowly this time, and looked directly at her. His eyes narrowed. He didn't smile. 8,000, he said. His paddle lifted again. The gavel hovered. Emery's throat tightened. She had no more to give. Not on paper. Not in dollars. But maybe. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out the photo of her father and Bramble, and walked, not toward the auctioneer's platform, but into the open space beside Bramble. She turned toward the crowd. "This dog," she said, holding up a photograph, "was my father's." Silence fell. The auctioneer's gavel stayed suspended in air. "My dad was Officer Liam Quinn," she continued, her voice rising only slightly. "He died in the line of duty last year. Bramble was his partner, his best friend. They were never apart." She looked down at Bramble, then back to the room. "I thought Bramble was retired to a safe home. I didn't know he ended up here. But I can't let him be sold to someone who doesn't know what he's worth. Not in money, but in memory." The crowd stilled. No one moved. Even the dogs, as if sensing something sacred, quieted. And Bramble wagged his tail. Not wildly, not in excitement, but slowly, thoughtfully, like a whisper against the wind. The tall man lowered his paddle, just slightly. The auctioneer looked at him, then at Emery. 8,000. Going once. She bit the inside of her cheek. Going twice. Her fingers clenched the photo so tightly its edges curled. And then he stopped. The man in the charcoal coat lowered his paddle fully. He looked at Emery one last time, then turned away. The auctioneer's voice came softer now, almost reverent. "Sold, to the girl with the soldier's heart." The gavel struck, but the sound was almost drowned out by the beating in Emery's chest. She took one step toward Bramble, who stood waiting, still proud, still watching. And together, without words, without hesitation, they moved toward one another, bridging a silence that had lasted far too long. The sound of the gavel still lingered in the rafters. It had echoed to the old barn like a pebble dropped in a deep lake, small at first, but rippling outward, brushing against the edges of everyone's silence. The auctioneer lowered his hand, slower than usual, like the act had turned sacred without his permission. His face, weathered and drawn from years of calling numbers and closing deals, had shifted into something quieter, like he too had just remembered what a life was worth. In the center ring, Bramble stood still. Emery had not yet moved. There was a beat of space, a breath held by the whole room, as girl and dog simply looked at each other. The wind, still working its way down from the western hills, sighed gently through the slats of the old building. Dust danced in beams of light. A man near the back cleared his throat, not from discomfort, but from something else. Emotion, maybe. Age. Then Bramble stepped forward. His paws touched the wooden floor with a softness that didn't match his size. He walked straight toward her, not fast, not eager, just sure, like he'd been walking toward her all along, through time, through distance, through every silence since her father died. Emery knelt as he reached her. Bramble pressed his forehead into her shoulder, his nose nudging gently beneath the collar of her coat, as if to say, "There you are." She wrapped both arms around his neck. And for the first time in what felt like months, years, maybe, her tears came. Not loud, not broken, just steady, like mountain snow melting under spring sun. Around them, the crowd didn't move. There was nothing left to bid, nothing more to say, except from one corner. The tall man in the charcoal coat still stood where he had last spoken, his shoulders slightly hunched, his paddle lowered, but his eyes fixed on the girl. He didn't look angry, nor kind, just paused, like someone trying to make sense of a language they hadn't heard in years. He took a step forward. Someone in the second row shifted in their seat, sensing the tension bend. A woman in her 60s held her breath and whispered, "Let it go." But the man didn't speak right away. He stepped once more into the aisle, then stopped, his voice quiet but sharp. "That's a working dog," he said, "not a pet." Several heads turned toward him. Emery rose slowly, one hand still resting on Bramble's back. Her cheeks were streaked but dry now. Her voice, when it came, didn't carry defiance, only clarity. "He's not a pet," she said. "He's family." The man didn't blink. "I've seen what those dogs can do," he said. "They're trained for power, control. They're not meant to live with children." Bramble sat beside her, calm as winter earth. "And yet," she said, "he lived with me my whole life, before you knew his name, before you wrote a check with no history behind it." The man opened his mouth again, but stopped. A handler, a younger man in a forest green vest, approached from the far end, quiet but firm. "She's right," the handler said. "That dog was more than a badge. He was a partner." He turned to Emery. "I served with your father once, not on the street, but in the same department. Liam talked about you all the time, called you the kid who asked too many smart questions. He kept a picture of you and Bramble on his locker door." Emery's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. The handler continued. "I was there the day Bramble came back after Liam, after the call. Bramble didn't eat for 3 days. Sat at the front door of the station. Just waited." He turned to the man in the charcoal coat. "No offense, sir, but there's nothing you could have paid today that'd match what that girl already gave up." The man said nothing. For the first time, his expression softened. Not to empathy, not quite, but to stillness. He nodded once, slowly, then stepped back. Turned. Left. No one clapped. No one spoke. Instead, the room began to breathe again. The auctioneer, still at his post, wiped a hand down his face. "Let's get the paperwork done," he said, not to anyone in particular, but to everyone who needed to know it was time. A small cluster of handlers gathered near the office table, pulling out files, pens, tags. One of them placed a manila folder gently on the surface. Another opened a small drawer and set down Bramble's badge, a flat brass piece engraved with his number and Liam Quinn's initials. Emery approached slowly, Bramble at her side. The girl and the dog walked not like victors, not like heroes, but like two travelers who had finally met on the same path again. Near the paperwork table stood an older man, one Emery hadn't seen earlier. He wore a tan canvas jacket faded by decades of sun, and a cap embroidered with a Hollow Creek police insignia. His boots were old but polished. His eyes, when they met hers, held something like recognition. He extended a hand. "You don't know me," he said, his voice lined with years and cigarettes. "But I knew your father." Emery didn't say anything, but she shook his hand. "I'm James Holloway," he continued. "Liam and I used to fish the Bitterroot River every spring. He never let me forget how I always lost my lure in the same tree." He smiled, faint but real. "I was there the first day he got Bramble," he added. "Watched the two of them circle each other for an hour like old rivals. Took Bramble less than a week to start sleeping at Liam's boots." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed, handwritten. "I found this in Liam's desk after he passed. I figured you'd come back one day." He handed it to her. Emery opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, hurried, familiar. "If something ever happens to me, Bramble goes to Emery. No question. He'll know her by the way she looks at him." She folded the paper gently, then looked up at James. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice small again. "You already did," he said, eyes moist. "By coming." The handler returned with a clipboard, asking for a signature. Emery wrote her name slowly, carefully, each letter feeling like it belonged in a story far larger than herself. Once it was done, they removed Bramble's collar and replaced it with a simple nylon one that Emery had brought from home. It was blue, frayed at the edges, and had once been her father's. She fastened it without help. The two stepped outside together into the late afternoon air. The sun was leaning toward the hills, casting long shadows on the gravel lot. The sky stretched pale blue above them, and the wind carried a scent of pine and chimney smoke, the kind of scent that settles into clothing and memory. Bramble sniffed the breeze, then looked up at her. Emery took the leash in her hand, not like a tether, but like an understanding. "Come on, boy," she whispered. "Let's go home." Outside the barn, the wind began to rise again. It came down from the northern hills, cold and soft, stirring leaves that had settled into corners of the gravel lot. Dust lifted in lazy spirals. A dog barked in the distance, sharp, singular, and then silence returned, heavier than before. Emery stood near the barn's edge, one hand resting lightly on Bramble's head. Her breath had slowed, her cheeks still blotched with the warmth of emotion. She felt like something inside her had shifted, not broken, but rearranged, as if a door long shut had quietly opened. Bramble stood beside her with quiet pride, his thick tail swaying low, contented, his body no longer stiff but grounded, not a soldier on guard, but something softer now, a guardian, yes, but also home again. Behind them, the barn's wide doors remained ajar. Most of the crowd had already begun to leave. People drifted away in clusters, murmuring, boots scraping on wood, eyes still glancing back toward the girl and the dog like they didn't quite want to forget. And then a voice called out, not loud, but certain, "Emery." She turned. The older man, James Holloway, had stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, the same man with the tan canvas jacket and quiet eyes. But this time he held something in his hands, a weathered envelope, thick and creased at the edges. He walked slowly, his boots crunching gravel with the rhythm of someone who'd never rushed a single step that truly mattered. When he reached her, he stopped just short of arm's length. He looked down at Bramble, who met his gaze for a long moment, ears up, tail still. And then, slowly, the old dog stepped forward and pressed his nose into the man's hand. James's jaw tightened. "Well, I'll be," he said, voice hoarse. "Still remembers the sound of my boots." He knelt. It was not easy for him. His knees cracked as he did, and the movement looked practiced in pain, but he lowered himself anyway and let Bramble nudge close. "He saved my life once," James said, still not looking at Emery. Not in the way people think. Not by charging in or chasing someone down. He just didn't leave. He ran a hand down Bramble's back, slow, careful. Your dad and I were pinned in an old farmhouse just west of the Bitterroot Woods. 2 suspects, armed. Radio jammed. One of them got behind us. I didn't hear him coming. James paused. The wind brushed past his shoulders. Bramble did. Knocked me down before the shot came. Took in the side instead. Emery drew in a breath. I stayed with your father at the hospital. Bramble was sedated. He had stitches from hip to chest. Didn't bark. Didn't whine. Just lay there with his eyes open, watching the door. Wouldn't sleep until Liam came in and said one word. What word? Emery asked, barely a whisper. James looked at her. Safe. That's all your dad said. And Bramble closed his eyes. He stood then, slower than he dropped, and looked at the envelope in his hands. I heard what you did in there. Heard what that man offered. And I saw you put everything you had on that table. He held out the envelope. Emery looked down at it. Her name wasn't written on it, but something about the way it was folded, the way it had clearly been held for a long time, made it feel personal. I paid the difference, James said simply. They were going to hold Bramble until funds cleared, but I didn't want you leaving this town with dog that still felt like a receipt. Emery froze. I didn't even know I owed, she started, her voice breaking. You don't, James said gently. Not a dime. She stared at him. Why? James looked past her, toward the emptying barn, toward the pale sky with streaks of thin cirrus clouds stretching like ghost stories across the blue. Because your dad once gave me a second chance, he said. He covered a mistake I made in the field. Quietly. Never used it against me. Just said, we all fall down Holloway. The good ones help each other back up. He met her eyes again. You're the good one now. The envelope remained in his hand, between them. Emery reached out and took it, carefully, like she might break something sacred inside. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked down at Bramble, who had settled at her feet again, tail tapping gently against the dirt. I don't know how to repay you, she said softly. James shook his head. You already did, he said. You came back. They stood in silence then, as the sun slipped lower behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the lot, brushing the earth with the color of ash and gold. Behind them, a last truck rumbled to life and rolled down the gravel road, headlights catching in the low dust. Somewhere far off, a bird called, one of those late autumn sounds, half mournful, half content, like the land itself was settling down for the season. James adjusted the collar of his jacket. You know, he said, Bramble's not the same dog he was 10 years ago, but there's still plenty left in him. I don't need him to be a soldier, Emery said. I just need him to know he's not alone. James smiled. He always knew that. You remind him. She stepped forward then, the envelope still clutched in one hand, and did something she hadn't planned. She hugged him. It wasn't long and it wasn't tight, but it was honest, a hug given not from obligation, but from understanding. His arms came up slowly, and though one hand trembled, he rested it briefly on her back. When they stepped apart, neither spoke. There was no need. Bramble gave a soft huff at their feet, and the wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. James looked down at the dog. You take good care of her now, he said. Bramble thumped his tail once in reply. The old man turned then and walked back toward the barn, his step steady. He didn't look back. Some people know when something is finished. They don't need to see the ending twice. Emery stood for a long time after he disappeared through the barn doors. She didn't cry. Not now. Instead, she looked down at Bramble, then out toward the road. They had a journey ahead, one made not of miles, but of healing. She knelt beside him again and whispered, Let's go home. And together, they walked into the wind, through leaves that danced at their feet, under sky that stretched wide and open and kind. The road home was lined with cottonwoods. Their yellowing leaves trembled in the crisp Montana air, brushing together like soft applause as the wind moved down from the Bitterroot Hills. Emery sat beside the window of the bus, forehead leaning gently against the cold glass, her fingers resting lightly on Bramble's thick fur. He lay curled beneath her feet, half asleep, half watchful, just as he always had been. The envelope James Holloway had given her was tucked inside her coat pocket, unopened but not forgotten. Some things didn't need to be read right away. Some things needed to breathe first, like tea leaves in hot water, steeping meaning slowly. Outside, the mountains stood still. They hadn't changed since her father's death. The ridges remained as solemn and enduring as ever. Snow dusted their peaks now, faint and temporary, like a warning or a blessing, depending on who was looking. And Emery, in her own quiet way, had learned to look differently. It was nearly dusk when the bus pulled off the main road and onto the gravel curve that led toward Flathead Ridge. She stepped off into cool air, Bramble at her heel, his ears alert, eyes soft. The world here smelled of pine needles, chimney smoke, and the brittle memory of summer. Somewhere beyond the trees, a creek hummed, its voice low from the drought, but constant, like a song whispered between stones. Her grandmother's house appeared slowly through the trees, a small, weathered structure with dark green shutters and a sloping tin roof that clattered during rainstorms. The porch swing still hung in place, though the seat was spotted with leaves. It creaked once in the breeze, like it remembered being used. They reached the front steps just as the first stars appeared. Inside, the house felt just as she'd left it, quiet but not empty. The smell of wood polish lingered faintly, mixed with the scent of sage her grandmother burned to keep the air honest, as she'd always said. Emery set her bag down near the door and unfastened Bramble's leash. He padded forward, slow but certain, as if memory alone mapped the house. He stopped near the fireplace, where a woven rug still lay in the same spot. Without hesitation, he circled twice, then lowered himself down and let out a deep, creaking sigh, the kind of sound a home makes when it finally settles after a long day. Emery watched him for a long moment before crossing to the mantel. There, still framed in oak, was a photo of her father in uniform, Bramble at his side. She hadn't touched it since the funeral. But tonight, she lifted the frame, wiped away a thin layer of dust, and placed a folded envelope from James beside it. A quiet offering. The days that followed were not extraordinary. There were no parades, no grand returns. Just mornings filled with cold floors and warm light, afternoons where Bramble followed her around the garden like he used to, and evenings where they sat on the porch together, listening. Sometimes, Emery would talk. Not often, but when she did, she spoke softly, as if telling secrets to the trees. And Bramble would listen. Always. She told him about school, about how her math teacher reminded her of the grumpy old chief her father used to joke about. She told him about the bird nest she found behind the shed, 3 perfect blue eggs inside. She even read aloud sometimes, her voice unsure at first, then steadier, as Bramble rested his head on her foot and let the sound of her voice become part of the air again. One afternoon, while cleaning out the old storage chest, she found something that made her stop. It was a small audio recorder, battered, scuffed, but still intact. Her father used it to dictate notes after patrols, small thoughts, things he didn't want to forget. She held her breath as she pressed play. Static, then a voice. April 23rd. Rainy. Emery asked me today if dogs remember people when they're gone. She froze. Told her they do. Told her dogs remember more than we do. Most days. Told her if anything ever happened, she should find Bramble. Said he'd know her by how she smells like lilacs and books. Her hand covered her mouth. The recording clicked off. No more words. Just that. Lilacs and books. She stepped out onto the porch, sat on the swing, and buried her face in Bramble's fur. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He simply was, and had always been. Autumn deepened. The nights grew longer, sharper. Emery learned to build fires again. Bramble's walks grew slower, more deliberate, but his spirit stayed bright. He'd perk up when a fox darted past the fence line, or when squirrels scattered across the yard like spilled marbles. He barked once at the old barn cat, then trotted back like a job well done. People in town began to notice, too. "Is that Quinn's dog?" the grocer asked one morning. "Didn't think I'd see him again." Emery nodded. "He came home," she said simply. That was all they needed. The town, in its own small, sturdy way, welcomed Bramble back. Old friends left treats on the porch. The vet down the road offered free checkups, saying that old dog's earned it. Her grandmother even began leaving the curtains open again, letting light back in. One evening, after the first frost, James Holloway returned. He didn't call first, just appeared at the gate, holding a brown paper bag and a thermos of coffee. Emery met him halfway. "I figured you want to see an old friend," he said, nodding toward Bramble, who had already trotted over, tail slowly wagging. They sat on the porch, sipping coffee, watching the trees let go of their final leaves. "He's slower," James said. "So am I," Emery answered. James laughed, the kind of laugh that sounds like wind through tall grass. "I brought something else," he said, pulling a small box from his coat. Inside was Bramble's old badge, polished, its brass warm in the afternoon sun. "I kept it," he said. "Figured you might want it now." Emery turned it over in her hand. LQ 027, her father's initials. She leaned down and clipped it to Bramble's collar. The old dog didn't flinch. He just stood there, wearing it like it had never left. That night, after James left, Emery lay awake a little longer than usual. She watched the shadows stretch and pull across the ceiling. Bramble slept by the door, one ear flicking now and then at the sound of an owl outside. And for the first time since her father died, Emery felt something return. Not wholeness, not happiness, but balance. The kind that doesn't come all at once. The kind that builds like a tide, slow, patient, and steady. One morning, weeks later, Emery walked the ridge behind the house. She stood at the top, looking out across the valley, toward the fields, the river beyond, and the mountains beyond that. The wind was cold but gentle, and the air held that quiet smell of coming snow. Bramble stood beside her, looking in the same direction. And in that moment, she didn't think of what they had lost. She thought of what remained. She knelt, rested her forehead against his, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." And Bramble, steady and still, pressed closer, as if to say, "I always would."